Well, I'm pretty excited today to be able to talk about growing fruit for your backyard. I've done a little bit of it myself, and I've worked with our community orchard, and basically I'm going to tell you a lot of things that I've learned either by the hard way or by learning from somebody else, and we've been able to do them right. So as we think about growing fruit, let me see if I can make it go. There it goes. Think about it's a perennial plant. So it's a plant that's going to come back over and over again. And I think as I looked at the list online, most of you probably already know that. But when we think about perennial plants, we think about commitment. So as you think about growing fruit, know that it's going to be a commitment. It's not just a short thing. So when you think about that commitment, make sure you like to spend time outside, because that's, if you're going to work with fruit, growing fruit, that's where you're going to be. And that's kind of a no-brainer for probably everybody that's on this, this session, learning session, or watching the video. Also think about how you want to use it. Do you want to just eat it? I grow black raspberries, and I have for years, and I love just going outside and eating it and bringing it in and having it on something else. Do you want to cook with it? Apples, do you want to make applesauce? Is that one of your favorite things? Or do you want to preserve it in such a way like jams or jellies, or make wine or cider with it? So think about these things also. When you plant fruit, like one of the things I just read online during this time was that one of the best things you can do for yourself is to eat fruits and vegetables. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people want to have more fruits and vegetables, and if they plant fruit, this probably isn't the year you're going to get fruit from it. So fruit is a long-term commitment. So are you willing to wait? Also, depending upon the fruit, you may need to be out there monthly with it and doing all sorts of different things that would help it grow. Are you willing to maintain that plant? So maybe it's pruning. If you have apple trees, in the cold of the winter, you're out there pruning apple trees. Or thinning, such as in apples. Also, you don't want every bloom that starts to make an apple to actually stay on the tree. And then are you willing to learn about the insects and the diseases that go with that particular fruit thing? So as we talk today, the things that I'm going to cover are a little bit about location. We're going to talk quite a bit about apples, because that's really what we get questions about in working with the orchard, is about apple trees. We'll talk a little bit about pruning and some other tree fruits and other small fruits. Let's get started with location. One of the first things we need to think about is, where are we going to put the fruit in our yard? Now, maybe your yard's flat and you're going to put it there. Maybe it's on a slope. Maybe it has great sun. Maybe it doesn't have a whole lot of sun. So let's look at some of those details. If it has a slope, we want to remember that cold air drops. So we wouldn't want to put it in a valley, because the cold air would be there too much. We want the cold air to drain out of that area. So if we do have a slope, we want to put it on the side of the slope. Also think about water drainage when you think about slopes, because if we have a great big gushing rain and the water comes down and your trees are sitting in water for an extended period of time, you can definitely have issues with them growing to be as healthy as they should be, or staying as healthy. Then we also need to think about light. So sun is 6 or more hours of light each day, and shade is only 3 hours of light each day. Now, depending on what kind of fruit it is, you may be able to inch by with some of those things of shade. When I was growing up, my dad had black raspberries. Kind of runs in the family, because I do too. We all loved them. My dad's were in full sun, but mine, up until about 10 years ago when we moved to a different house, they were in almost total shade. Worked just fine. I got just as many raspberries as he did. But that's not true of most fruit. Most fruit does need that 6 hours or more of light. We also want to think about our climate. So when you pick what kind of fruit, because of the cold air and the cold winters we have, you can't necessarily grow everything. Some fruits just don't work being this cold. I will tell you about some cherries that are pretty cool a little later that are sweeter, because oftentimes here, with as cold as we can't grow sweet cherries. We also need to think when we're talking about location about the spacing. How big will these bushes get? Both tall and wide. So a mistake I made was I had these teeny little elderberry twigs that somebody gave me, and I'm pacing off how far it should go, and the elderberries grew a lot bigger than what I had read about. And so unfortunately, they're butting into a cherry bush that I have. And I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And I keep having to trim the elderberries back quite a bit. So I have to manage them more than I would like to. When we're thinking about location, don't forget soil. We've already talked a little bit about water drainage. So think about the drainage of the soil. Is it heavy clay? Does it drain well? Is it mostly sand? What kind of drainage do you have? Also think about the acidity. And I really want to mention this because of blueberries. Who doesn't like blueberries? I would say most of us probably do. And so blueberries need very high acid soil, higher acid than we have here in the Midwest. And so when we want to grow blueberries, maybe we need to think about some other berries that are similar to that. And I'll help you understand a few of those a little later. It's always a great idea to take a soil sample and send it in to find out what is in your soil and what amendments you may need. Water is really important when you're growing fruits. And so think about how close the nearest hose or water is. Besides drainage, think about that establishing and maintaining water that those fruit, either trees or bushes or plants need. Weed control. I struggle with weed control just like every other gardener. And the competition here for fruit is for the water and the nutrients that go there. Sometimes it can be for sunlight when they're small also. So we need to think about weed control along with our location. Let's get started with apple trees. As I said, in the orchard, that's what we get the most questions on, and that's probably true because it's an apple orchard, basically. I want to talk a little bit about my mistakes I made and the orchard mistakes and the orchard things we did right. So a couple years before we started the orchard in South Sioux City, I found some apple trees. Oh, they were end of the season. They were cheap. They still looked good. And they were in these big pots. And I bought them and hauled them home, told my husband we were going to start a small orchard. We already had a pear tree and some cherry trees and stuff like that. But we were going to start this small apple orchard because I always wanted my own apples. Well, we planted them. We planted them correctly. About 2 years later, the orchard in South Sioux was planted. I would tell you, I got apples off of the apple trees in the orchard that were planted with bare root trees faster than I did off of the ones in the pots. You can see our two main volunteers out at the orchard, Ron McCumber and Linda Castor. They're taking some bare root trees out for us to be able to soak them and then plant them. Those trees did a lot better. I would highly recommend bare root trees. They really establish well quicker than the ones in the pots. Also the ones in the pots, especially toward the end of the season, or if somebody kept them for a year and then are selling them the following year, those roots will girdle in that pot. And sometimes it's hard to get those roots to really spread out and establish well. So bare root, approximately 1 year old, approximately 2 to 3 feet tall with good roots. We want to also be careful about the rootstock we'll get, and I'll have a slide in a little bit about rootstock, but it tells us the height of the tree and the disease and insect resistance. Do be careful of those dried, stunted, diseased, and discount trees. They really aren't that great of a deal in the long run. So the University of California says that the best or the most successful trees to get are about 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch across. And so we don't want very big trees to start with when we talk about fruit trees, especially apple trees. So I would like to talk a little bit about rootstock and what it does. Rootstock will determine the size or the height of the tree, the disease and insect resistance, what kind of soil it grows best in, and the hardiness of that tree. And so what happens, rootstock is actually the bottom part of the tree. It's the roots, and it comes up partway on the stem. And what they do is they cut that rootstock tree off, and they take whatever kind of apple we think we want, and they graft it onto that roots. So rootstock is pretty important. Usually when we buy trees, we buy them based on the variety and the rootstock to know the size of the tree. But rootstock does more than size. The two on this slide that have apples by them, the semi-dwarf and the dwarf, are the two most common rootstocks that people usually have. The semi-dwarf will make a tree about 8 to 12 feet tall. Now, depending on the conditions, it may grow a little bit taller than that. It usually gives us 4 to 5 bushels of fruit, a good amount of fruit to be able to do for a home. A dwarf tree is shorter than that. It's only 5 to 8 feet tall and only will give us about a bushel of fruit. Now think back to location with me for just a minute. Where are you going to put the tree? How much space is around it? Will other trees compete with it? Can you have it far enough away to get a bigger tree, or do you need a smaller tree? I had a neighbor who put in an ultra dwarf tree. It was only 3 feet tall. It was, I can't remember exactly how many apples it gave, but not very many apples at all. And in about 5 years, it kicked the bucket in a storm because the root system wasn't enough to hold it very well. The other one that is, if you've been out on an old farmstead or something and seen this great big apple tree, that's a standard. It gets tall and it has lots and lots of fruit. And it's kind of a pain to be able to get up to pick that fruit, to be honest. So usually we choose semi-dwarf or dwarf with rootstocks. Let me also talk about seasons and maturity of apples. We have several seasons. We have a summer season, an early season, a mid-season, and a late season. The first two, the summer and the early season, are usually just plain eating apples. We love to go out there and pick those apples. They normally do not keep very well when we want to keep them. The late season, on the other hand, are usually great keepers. They ripen September to October. Now, how do we tell when an apple is ripe? Well, what is happening when that apple gets ripe is the starch in the apple turns to sugar. The seeds in the apple start to turn darker. The acidity decreases. The respiration increases, meaning it's losing moisture. The cell walls start to weaken and the fruit softens as it gets riper and too ripe. We've all seen that. Matter of fact, earlier this morning for a snack, I had an apple that was definitely starting to get soft. So those are things with maturity. I would say one of the best things to do is just try it. If you think it's close, it's about the right time frame, try it. A mistake we made out at the community orchard was we have some early season apples and we saw them and they looked nice, but they didn't look quite ripe to us, and we were pretty busy doing other things. And with normal I and the volunteers, we try to get out there often, but we don't always get out there real often. And we missed it. Those apples were too ripe by the time we actually figured out that they were ready to eat. Well, we won't do that again because now we know. But do check them if you think they're getting ripe. And if you have a tree that you don't know, somebody says, come pick apples. Try it before you pick a whole bunch of apples and know that you've gotten too ripe of apples. Let's talk a bit about planting. One of my first hints on planting is take 2 shovels with you, or take a shovel and a long stick, because sometimes it's hard to gauge how deep that tree is going to be once you put dirt back into the hole on the roots. So initially when we think about planting, think about the space and picking a well-drained soil. A minimum of 18 inches of soil depth that is workable, because that's really where most of your roots for an apple tree or most fruit trees are going to be. You want the hole wide enough that all the roots can spread out. You don't want to wrap roots around a hole. What happens with fruit trees, as many other trees, when you wrap the roots around the hole, they start going in a circle and they don't reach out. Sometimes our soil in a circles because we've dug that hole is looser and it's easier for the roots to go through that looser soil. But really what we want those roots to do, as you all know, is to go straight out. And so make sure when you plant the tree, the roots go straight out and there's enough room. The graft, that's between the rootstock and the top of the apple tree of the variety you want. That graft, that little point, let me see if I can point to it with the arrow, right where that line is, that graft union, you want at least 2 to 3 inches above the soil line. If that graft goes below the soil line, it will start to send out roots and it will change the height of your tree. It will change a variety of things with your tree. In the community orchard, I wasn't there the day they planted the most of the trees. And they had a whole bunch of volunteers doing it who had not planted before. And what they did was they planted with that graft just above the soil level. And as we watered the trees, what happened was most of those grafts lowered into the soil. And so we spent a couple of days with a tree spade and we lifted about 100 trees. I never want to do that again, and I hope you don't ever have to do that. So know that when it's loose soil, that tree will also start to sink back into the hole a little bit. So make sure that graft is high enough up that that doesn't happen. When you plant fruit trees, no fertilizer. Absolutely no fertilizer. Sometimes we think, oh, just a little bit. But we really don't want fertilizer when that tree starts, and we don't want very much fertilizer the whole life of that tree. Trim any broken or damaged roots. So if you have any roots that look like they're not healthy, go ahead and trim them off. If you did buy that tree and it was in a pot and you get it out and those roots want to girdle another root, you'll want to look at that very carefully and try to trim some of those roots that might girdle another root. You want all the roots to be able to go and spread out. Sometimes if you have a long root that's in a circle, you may want to trim that also. It's easier to plant a tree with two people. If you've ever done it, you know how that goes. One person can hold the tree in the right place. The other one can start putting dirt around it. Also, as you plant the tree, it's a good idea to water as you plant because that helps take care of the air pockets that might get in there. So a little bit of dirt, a little bit of water, a little bit of dirt, a little bit of water. Water that tree when you first plant it very well, 2 to 5 gallons slowly. If you have a bucket that you can put a small hole in, that's a great idea to do. You may let it sit on one side, then go to another side and fill it and do that kind of thing so that it gets a good amount of water initially to start. Pollination. Apple trees need a pollinator. That can be a bee, either a native bee or a honeybee. It can be other insects. It can be a person, actually, that does that. Most of them need a pollinizer. That means another tree's pollen to come to them. So cross-pollination, the transfer of pollen between two different species or varieties. We do have some apple trees that are self-unfruitful, meaning they can't pollinate themselves, or self-sterile. We do have some apple trees that have sterile pollen, meaning they can't pollinate another apple tree. So if you have a wine stop or a Jonagold, and you have one other tree, that other tree won't get the pollen from these two to be able to make fruit. We do have a few varieties that are self-fruitful, meaning they can pollinate themselves, but normally they make a better fruit if they have a different one to pollinate them. So we also need to keep track when we think of pollination at what time the apple blooms are out that they want to be pollinated. And I'll give you an example of that with a cherry bush that I have. We'll talk about this cherry bush a little later. It's from Canada. And I bought a Romeo cherry bush and a Juliet cherry bush. And I thought, how cute, I have Romeo and Juliet. But one of them blooms too far in front of the other one. And after having them for several years, I get very few cherries off of either one because their pollination times of needing that pollen are not the same. I'm going to have to buy a third one that is in between those to be able to get fruit on my cherry bushes. Talking about pruning, I can tell you that I just was afraid to prune my trees too much. And out at the orchard, you can tell that we were afraid to prune too much also. And we don't have the right framework in a lot of our trees out at the community orchard because we were a little bit too afraid when they were young trees to prune correctly. This spring, I planted 3 new trees at my house. I took out a lot of those trees that I'd bought in pots because they just didn't do as well. And I planted 3 new ones. And I definitely know that I'm going to be more of an active pruner on those trees to get the framework of the tree correct. So I have less pruning later as the tree is older. And it's, as you prune bigger branches, it's harder on trees. We all know that. So really what we want is we want airflow and we want sunlight into a tree. And so this is a top view of the tree when it's pruned. And you can see there is airflow and sunlight. Unfortunately, at our community orchard and some of my older trees, it looks like not this one because I wasn't active enough in working at pruning. Now, you don't want to take the entire tree and prune it all gone, but you want to make sure that you have about 5 branches coming out that are main branches. And you can do that in several layers in your tree. but you want those layers apart so that you have airflow and sunlight to all of the tree. This is probably one of the things, pruning, that I struggle with the most because I'm a little afraid to take them out. But read some good books on pruning, look at some university sites that have some details on pruning. I want to give you a few more tips on pruning. So there are certain kinds of things we want to get rid of and certain kind of angles that we want our trunks to have. So if it's a V angle, we don't want that on a tree, and you want to get rid of that early on in the tree. We want our best angles on our tree to be about 60 degrees. So it's not straight out, but it's not far from straight out. There are several things we don't want on trees, especially apple trees. This is peach trees, trees with stone fruits are trimmed a little bit different than apple trees normally. So one of the things we don't want on apple trees is the shoots that go straight up, because shoots that go straight up don't give us fruit. And so those, we want to get rid of those. Those are called suckers. We want to get rid of stubs or broken branches. If you've pruned trees before, we prune apple trees the same, where you prune it back to the collar that's on the tree and not leave a stub. I know initially when I first started, that was one of my mistakes. I left too many stubs and I've had to go back and clean those out. Downward growing branches are hard on a tree because if they do get fruit on them, then that weighs that branch down and it's more likely to break from a downward growing branch. We don't want two branches rubbing against each other, so you have to decide which branch do I want to keep. We don't want shaded interior branches. And with most apple trees, we have what we call a leader, or one that goes straight up. And we don't want it to compete with something else because they'll kind of fight to be who gets to be the tallest. So in a little bit, I'll get to Denise's question here. If we have narrow crotches or whorls. So whorls is kind of this extra one going out on the side that we don't, it's starting from the tree coming out. Let's find where the I one is at. Okay, so it's over by these two A ones and it's kind of a straight one going out. So Denise asks, if you prune to 5 points, should the second layer be twisted a bit to the clockwise to make fuller? So let me understand that. So we've got 5 points going around, and in a tree you can have about, depending on what size that tree is and how low you want, if you're going to mow underneath it or things like that. But let's say we go up 4 feet and we start our first group of 5, and they shouldn't be all 5 on the same level. They should have different levels to them. And then we'll want to leave about a foot or to 18 inches or so, and then do our next one so that there is space in between it. Does that answer your question, Denise? While she's writing, we'll go ahead and go to that. Yes, perfect. So let's take a bit of a time here and let's look at some other tree fruits, because apples aren't the only ones we might grow. And so pears. When I moved to the house that I live in now, I inherited a pear tree, and I absolutely love a pear tree. Pears grow well in our climate here, and pears are an excellent fruit to be able to eat. Most need a second cultivar to pollinate. Now, I only have one pear tree at my house, but I do have an ornamental pear tree at my house. And our forester over with Nebraska Extension came and visited my house several years ago, and he said, "Where's your second pear tree?" And I said, "I don't have one." He says, "Well, your neighbors must." And I'm saying, nobody close to me has a pear tree. And what we came to decide is that the ornamental pear probably was pollinating my pear tree. He had never heard of that. I'd never heard of that, but either that or it's a self-pollinating one. There are a couple different cultivars that you can get. You want to make sure you get one that is fire blight resistant. Fire blight, we've had fire blight in some of the apple trees out at the community orchard, and we took the entire row out in the middle of winter and got rid of them. And you don't want fire blight. It's hard to control, and so just get ones that are resistant to fire blight. Pears, most pears, not every pear, but most pears actually are a lot better if you harvest them a little bit at the green stage, meaning they're not quite ripe yet. So I'll tell you what happens at my pear tree. If I let it go to where I think it's ripe and pick it, there's parts of it that are mushy. So what I want to do is I don't want it a hard stage, but I want to get it about a week before that mushy stage, week to 10 days, somewhere in there. And I want to pick it. And what I do is we have 2 tables we can eat on, one in our kitchen area and one that's a dining room table. And when it's pear season, the dining room table isn't used to eat on. It's used as a staging area. And I have short boxes like a pop flat or something like that I usually put something in the bottom of it, white, like either wax paper or something like that in the bottom of it. And I stage my pears on their ripeness. And I pick them and I leave them out on a single layer on that table and let them ripen off of the tree. And I'll tell you, they're delicious. They are just delicious. But if I leave them on the tree, they get kind of grainy and they have soft spots in them. So if you're thinking of pears, you want to try that first year to see if the pears that you have, it's better to pick early. Another tree that grows really well here in our climate is sour cherries. They do like well-drained soil. They're usually self-fruitful, and semi-dwarf are usually preferred. They're usually hardier in our area. Some other ones we may have would be plums, and plums also like well-drained soils, but disease and insects can be problems with plums, especially if you have a wild plum thicket close to your plums. That can definitely be an issue. Peaches. I'll tell you what, when I first planted my little orchard here at my house, I put in 2 peach trees. I was gonna do it, and I was gonna make them work. Well, one died, and real early this spring, I took the other one out because it just had too many issues with diseases. And so I'm kind of not gonna do peaches at my house. We do have a few peaches out at the community orchard. They've been in a number of years. Last year was the first year we actually got peaches on it, and there was about 6 peaches, and there was about 6 of us working that day. We each got 1 peach. So peaches can be more problematic. If you're on the call today and you have a peach tree that's growing well, I'd love for you to write that in the chat box so we know and we can kind of gain experience from you with that. Apricots are another thing that can be grown here. The house that I moved into about 10 years ago did have an apricot tree that was in pretty bad shape, and we took it out fairly in a few years afterwards. They bloom early, so late frost can be problems for them, and cross-pollination is needed. Okay, let's go on to some other fruits that we commonly grow here. Many of you probably grow them, and many of you are probably better than I am about growing them. Strawberries. I have a small strawberry bed myself. We have some strawberries that we just planted out at our community orchard in a raised bed. They are self-fruitful. They like well-drained soils. Out at our community orchard in the spot where they would go, the soil is absolutely horrible to dig in, and they would struggle, so that's one of the reasons we put them in a raised bed. There are a couple different kinds of strawberries. There's the June-bearing, there's ever-bearing or day-neutral ones. So strawberries. Raspberries, I could tell you a little bit more about, especially black raspberries. I've grown them for, Well, my dad grew them as I was growing up. They probably had about 10 years I didn't, and I've grown them ever since. So I've grown a lot of black raspberries, but red raspberries, there's golden raspberries, there's purple raspberries. They do work best with support, and there are some raspberries that don't have thorns on them, but many of them do, and so some people don't like them in their home landscape because of that. And managing those helps with not getting thorns. I've done it so much that I'm doesn't bother me at all to do that. And there's several ways to support them. I have one way that I use at my house with poles and just a wire across, and I use zip ties to zip the canes up to the ties or to the wires. And we're trying a different way out at the orchard. If you know the Voices for Food Learning Garden that Marion Kane is doing, she has a couple ways that she does raspberries there that are pretty successful. So you could contact her and go and visit that garden to see that. We have started raspberries out at our orchard, and you could come and see one of the ways that we've tried it sometime if you visit us out there also. There's different times that you can get raspberries to actually have their fruit. Blackberries are another one. They're very similar growing to raspberries, but they're not as hardy as raspberries. Grapes. Anybody on the call grow grapes? If you'd write that in the chat, I'd love to see that. I started some grapevines at my house. And unfortunately, my Concord grapevine, I replant a new Concord grape almost every year. I think once I had it go 2 years. I just am not very good at grapes, so we're just going to breeze through grapes here. And if somebody is better at it and can help us with that, we'd love to have them do that. They are self-fruitful. They grow in a wide range of soils. There's cultivars for colder weather, and they're very sensitive to weed killers. I would tell you that I killed a tree growing next to one of my grapevines, and it wasn't the Concord. I have another grapevine too that actually is doing pretty well, but I had a couple of those, and I think I killed the grapevine because I killed the tree that was growing next to it. They do work best trellising. At my house, I actually have them going over an archway, and it's kind of cool when they have gotten big enough on the top to be hanging down, and I've seen that other places. At our community orchard, we're hoping to do some trellis that would go up like that, and we're also doing some traditional grape. We just planted them this year. Now, what about some of those other things that might be worth a try? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some bush cherries that I heard about a number of years ago that are, they were developed in zone 2, okay? So they'll work in our climate. They're the Romeo and Juliet that I have. And I'm going to be getting a Carmine Jewel, as you can see listed there. There's a whole series of them. They were developed at the University of Saskatchewan, and they're sweeter. So you measure sweetness of fruit by Brix. That's the name of how sweet they are. And they are definitely sweeter than the sour cherries that we have. They aren't quite as sweet as like a Bing cherry or one of those kinds of cherries that we get, but they definitely are sweeter. Worth a try, I think. We have just planted a whole bunch in our community orchard. It is good to have a couple varieties, but I would just recommend, and I looked for the Carmine Jewel to see if I could order it late this year, and there's one place I could order it from. It would be $30 for the bush and $20 for shipping, and I decided to wait one more year before I bought it. You'll need to order those early because they usually do sell out, but make sure you get Carmine Jewel and then either one of the other ones. Some natives that may be worth a try. Elderberry. As I said, I have elderberries at my house. I have elderberry syrup we have on pancakes often. I love it. I do want to tell you a little story about elderberries. I had somebody call my office, and as most of you know, if you know me, my specialty is actually food safety. It's not horticulture. but I grew up with a grandma that had her own private park and a mom that had her own private greenhouse. And so I love dabbling in horticulture type things. And by the way, I did have the university horticulturist that oversees our county review the slides and talk through with them before I presented this the first time to make sure everything was correct. And she helped me with a few points that I've hopefully given on to you. But I had somebody call my office and asked about elderberries. They had went to pick elderberries, and if you know anything about elderberries, they grow in clusters. So the picture here of the elderberry cluster with all those teeny fruits, she had picked each one separately and filled a 5-gallon bucket with elderberries. And if you've ever picked elderberries, usually what you do is you pick the whole cluster off, you take them inside and you work at getting them off with your fingers in water or under running water. And she had picked that whole one in the evening, let the 5-gallon bucket sit, and the next morning called me and said, I don't think I can use these. Elderberries, if you want to do elderberries, you need to harvest them and do something with them at the same time. Plan on a good, 4 or 5 hours, depending on what you want to do with them. Or freeze the elderberries, clean them and freeze them, and you do something with them later. So we do have a question here. I don't know if I missed it earlier, but how large do the cherry bushes get? My bushes are about 4 years old, and they're about 5 feet tall at this point. I think they'll get a little bit taller than that, but I don't think they'll get much taller than 5 feet. So they're a great bush to add to a landscape. Just make sure you get 2 of them. And the flowers this spring were just absolutely gorgeous. So gooseberries would be a small fruit that's worth a try that's a native. So what about some unique things that maybe have been around a while but kind of aren't thought of that much? So aronia berries. If you've been at the garden show before, early on in the garden show, we had quite a few speakers on aronia berries. And I have a couple in my garden also. You can see the big black fruit right here in the bush. My bushes of aronia are my oldest bush is about 3 years old, and it's probably only about 3 feet so far. I would tell you that I've seen some aronia bushes that are at the Heskel Egg Lab at Concord, Nebraska, and those were about probably 8 to 10 feet tall. They were in a spot that they loved, but they were very tall. So aronia can grow tall. Currants would be another one that's there. Jostaberry, which is a cross between a currant and a gooseberry. Honeyberries and Saskatoon berries. I want to talk just a bit about that, and I'll come back to Denise and we'll talk about grapes back again from the chat. So honeyberries and service berries will be your closest thing to blueberries. Now, I would tell you that we planted honeyberries out at our community orchard fairly early on, planted them in horrible clay dirt. They didn't like it at all, moved them to another spot. They weren't very happy there, and we didn't want them there either. And so we actually moved them another time. This year, we have had tons of blooms on our honeyberries. So the reason I'm telling you that is find a spot that is well drained, that they'll get plenty of sun in, that you can keep them wet when they need to be wet, especially when you're establishing them. And then you'll be able to get berries sooner with the honeyberries. I'm anxious to try them. What I've read about them is they are very similar to blueberries. Some service berries, when you look in the catalogs to buy them, are listed as a type of blueberry, but they're actually a service berry. They don't need the acid that blueberries need. So think about those. We did plant some of those just this spring in our community orchard, so they might be an option for you also. I would tell you the ones that we got were very, very small, so it's going to take quite a while for them to be able to come. And instead of sending us one, I think they sent us two because evidently not all of them are growing yet. So we're going to leave them a little while. And as I said, blueberries struggle. Denise did put in the chat something about grapes. Let's find out what she said. Denise says, I have grapevines. I grow one on my chain link with a cable wire extension. They're approximately 30 years old. Wow. I use as a privacy fence and grapevine wreaths. Grapes have gone to wild, so I let the birds eat the grapes. Thanks, Denise, for sharing that with us. I know when I was growing up, my mom would go to a farmer that was a friend of ours to his field, and he had wild Concord grapes, and we always had Concord grape juice after that. Delicious. Not that grape juice from the store isn't good, but boy, homemade is really good. So let's talk about, we only have a few minutes left here, and let's talk about a few of the things that I didn't cover that if you want to grow fruit, you're going to need to look into. One of them is pest management. There's different pests for different fruits, so you need to find out what kind of fruit you have and what pests mainly are problematic with that one. What kind of insects, diseases, what kind of sprays can you use if you want to spray and still use that fruit, and how far in advance do you need to do that? Or is it during the bloom period? And if it's during the bloom period, are you going to hurt pollinators? So you have a lot of things to think about as we do it. We know some insects do like to get in when the fruit is just forming, so right after the bloom period. And also think about rodents. As I think about weed control, out at our community orchard, we do use mulch, but when you go to most commercial orchards, they do not, because they spray that ground with Roundup or something like that and kill those weeds around it, and they don't let anything there. And one of the reasons is rodents. They don't want the rodents to get to and chew on the trees. I would tell you at our community orchard, we pull that mulch away before winter comes so we don't have anything close to the tree bark over the winter. We do have Julie. She said, goji berry, sucker and seed everywhere after only 2 seasons. That is good to know. I have not ever grown that. We didn't plant it in our community orchard. But if you don't want that, don't plant them. So as I said earlier, my specialty is not horticulture with the University of Nebraska. It is actually food and food safety and food preservation. I work a lot with Renee Sweers from the Iowa State office on some of those things. And so I had to include a slide on that fruit afterwards. So we'll start out by don't hurting the tree or bush when you harvest the fruit. So apple trees, if you pull the apple off wrong, you could pull a lot of the spurs that would actually make next year's apples off. I know when people come to our orchard, we always give them a quick lesson on how to pick an apple and not hurt the tree for next year. Know if things are ripe before you pick them, because picking one apple off and checking if it's ripe is okay, and if it's not ripe, you leave the rest. But picking a whole bushel and finding out they're not ripe and they won't ripen off is not a good thing. Some fruits are highly perishable and need to be used very quickly. The example that I gave was elderberry. Short-term storage, mostly that is refrigerated, and don't wash fruits until it's time to use them. Now, some harder fruits you could do that with, but things like elderberries, strawberries, those kinds of things, you actually encourage any wild spores that are on them to grow mold faster. Long-term storage, a lot of that will depend on the particular fruit, but if it's fridge, then make sure it's at the proper temperature, because some fruits do better at a really cold temperature just below freezing. Some fruits don't like that at all. And also some fruits will make other fruits in a fridge either ripen faster or do things that we don't want to happen. Frozen. You need space if you're going to freeze them, and containers to do that that will be okay in the freezer for a long term. This past year, I made applesauce, and I made a thicker applesauce that I used the peels and stuff with, and froze it, and man, was it good. We are almost out of it, and I'm very sad, to be honest, because it was delicious. Canned. So you need to have canning equipment to do it properly, and you need to have space and containers, and you can do it as either fruit or jam and jelly. And both ISU and UNL have information on how to do that. I know at UNL we are redoing our canning publications right at this very moment. They are still current. We're adding a few more things to them, like steam canning for fruits and jellies. And so if you do those kinds of things, please do them properly and do them safely so you don't make anybody sick. Dehydrated, you can do it as fruit or fruit leather. My pear tree that I tell you with, I either can or dehydrate all the pears from that, and love eating those as going on. Or you can make juice, cider, wine, or syrup from them. So I did want to mention just a little bit about our community orchard. I talked about it through the whole talk. It's in South Sioux. If you want to drive by it, we'd love to have you drive by and see in this time of COVID when we're not getting together. And when we can get together, we will have open houses to be able to come in, or if you want to contact me, we can do a private showing if you'd like to come and see. So it is in South Sioux. If you know where the railroad tracks go from Nebraska to Iowa, the orchard is just on the north side of the railroad tracks. And if you want to be involved, we are looking for volunteers. This spring, Linda Castor, one of our volunteers, probably planted herself 500 to 600 plants. We added a lot more pollinators this year. She's done a lot of work out there, so a shout out to her. But we are missing the rest of our volunteers. And if you'd like to volunteer, some ways that you could do that would be to help us maintain the trees or bushes, help with hosting a group. We do have, when school is in session, we have kindergartners that come out that learn about apples in school, and then they come out and they actually get to see apples growing. Or help plant and maintain our pollinator gardens that we have, our rain gardens. And you can contact me for more information. And I saw that Caitlin put her email in there. If you don't have mine, you can actually go ahead and contact her. Or you can contact Nebraska Extension in Dakota County, and you can reach me that way. So an address for the orchard, I didn't put that in here. Might have to, I don't know if I know an exact address. If you know where the new tennis building is in South Sioux, or the other place you might know would be the soccer fields in South Sioux. If you keep going along that road that's close to the river, just before you get to the railroad bridge, on the north side of the railroad bridge, there's a street, and if you turn there, you'll see it. We have a deer fence around most of the apple trees. We didn't the first 2 years, and all the trees were, after winter, there was no tops on the trees, so we did that. Thank you very much. I do have a couple slides of resources, and if you're interested in those resources, we can make those available on the Siouxland Garden Show site. I did want to give credit to Vaughn Hammond. He's a former UNL extension educator and orchard specialist. He works privately now, but he's the one that taught me everything I know about orchards. We had him up for a number of classes a number of years ago when he actually worked still for the university. And so Kathleen Q is our horticulturist here over in Dakota County who helps us with the orchard now. And she's the one who reviewed the slides. And so I'll go to some of the resources. One of the things I would say as you look for resources, one of the best things to do is under Google, search things like growing apple trees, site, and is that the colon or the semicolon? English was never my best subject, but the 2 dots, edu. And that will only bring up sites that are educational. And then look under those of places that are similar weather to us. So at the University of Nebraska, we have pruning fruit trees, apple scab. On the next slide, I have one of the Iowa State publications. Washington State is a little bit not quite our climate, but they have some great resources on tree fruit or backyard tree fruit. Here's the Growing Fruit in Iowa publication, and I actually have it. If you look in the picture, that's what it looks like. It's a great publication. It's actually an older publication that they have re-looked at probably several times, and it is very up to date, a great publication to do. If you want to know about the dwarf cherry bushes, the history from the University of Saskatchewan on it, different things, stone fruits. Minnesota has a great one on stone fruits. Growing fruit trees in Maine, that's a good one to look at. So there are a variety of good ones to be able to look at. So thank you very much. Are there any other questions that we have? I know I've went within minutes of my time today, but I would stay and answer any questions. If you have other questions about fruit trees, if you want to know more about the community orchard and you're a Facebook person, that's where I post most things at. We're trying to get a website up, and we were working on that for the community orchard, but COVID came, and so other things took precedent. So my secretary did just say to me the other day, when are we going to get back to that? So hopefully we'll have a website with basic information. But at this point, Facebook, and let me go back to that slide of the orchard, and do I have it on there? Oh, South Sioux City Community Orchard, Facebook, South Sioux City Community Orchard. Find us on Facebook and just like it, and like a few of the posts, and then they'll show up on your feed. And I think we might have had another question. Nope, just thank yous, I think. Great, thanks so much, Caitlin. If you have anything else, I will stop sharing and we can go back.